This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. We've got a fun show for you today because we're talking about a fun sport, professional wrestling. Pro wrestling is one of the most unusual sports out there since the outcomes are predetermined and drama takes center stage. But as our guest today, reporter Stephen Montemayor, will tell you, the athletic feats happening on those stages are real, and so are the risks that the athletes are taking. And it just so happens that Minnesota has made big contributions to the development of pro wrestling. That's what we're going to be talking about on today's show. This question came from reader Casey Carmody, a pro wrestling fan who wanted to know more about Minnesota's place in the history of the sport.
I've been a fan of professional wrestling for a while, and really I like the history and kind of the performance and just kind of the general circus of it. And I really got interested in asking this question because I was chatting with some friends about how the World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, was considering Minneapolis as one of the finalists for WrestleMania, the big wrestling event the WWE holds each year. And, you know, it just kind of got me thinking about, Minnesota really has a good, long history with wrestling, you know, from the territorial days with, you know, things like AWA to a governor who was a former wrestler. And then also, you know, a lot of the local indie scene. The ones that I think about, you know, most often is First Wrestling that does WrestlePalooza still at First Avenue, and watching those guys. And so it just seems to be kind of part and parcel of Minnesota. So I was really curious about why that was.
Thanks to Casey for submitting that question. And here's my conversation with Stephen.
Well, Stephen, thanks so much for joining us today. You know, one of the fun parts of my job is that we get a question like this, and I can sort of ping the newsroom and see who's passionate, who likes this topic, and you're a fan. And so I think that's what you bring a lot to this because you grew up watching this sport. So tell us a little bit about you and what your background is sort of watching this.
Yeah, well, like a lot of people that I spoke to for this story, it was just something that I became really passionate about as a kid growing up, probably 8 years old or even earlier than that, and followed it quite closely, both on weekly television shows, was scouring the internet for as much information as I could find, and just consumed magazines and old videos, and just kept watching, and then sort of fell out a little bit around high school, and then picked it back up again during the pandemic when we're all looking for things to do, and
right.
It was easy to find some good stuff on streaming.
Okay, let's talk about pro wrestling. Like it or not, I think that this is a sport that generates some eye rolls from people. Not everybody takes it seriously, but it clearly has staying power. It clearly has a huge fan base. So tell us a little bit make the case about this for us, because it's one of the most unusual sports out there. And so just tell us a little bit about what's the deal with this sport?
I like to sort of describe it as theater. It's something that will incorporate a lot of, it's athleticism and some pretty amazing, physical feats, which by the way, are themselves not at all, fake. We're talking about a lot of, pretty risky and impressive physical feats there, but at the same time it brings in a lot of theater, a lot of storytelling, in some cases comedy, in some cases drama. So it really covers the spectrum there to where there are predetermined outcomes to these stories, but that's it. That's just it. They're stories. It's
right.
It's not as if we're all going to Hamilton and kind of quibbling over whether that really was Hamilton on the stage,
right.
For example.
So it's really about how you sort of approach it. Like if you approach it trying to equate it with, like who's going to win a running race or, something
right.
like that, that's not the right attitude to have. It's
Exactly.
really about the theater. And it has roots in sort of Greco-Roman style wrestling, except there's fewer chairs being smashed over people's
Exactly.
heads and that kind of wrestling, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Some people may have heard the name Vern Gagne. I had heard it. I had seen it in our coverage. I didn't really know why this was significant. And then when you hear the story, both on the national level and on the local level, you realize that this guy, he's the forefather of at least the Minnesota wrestling scene. So to start this story, we have to go back to the 1940s. So talk to me about Vern Gagne in the 1940s.
Well, at that time he was starring as a football player and collegiate wrestler for University of Minnesota. He very soon after graduating gets an offer to play football for the Chicago Bears, which at that time certainly was not on the same level as getting an NFL contract offer today. So it's not as though he was turning down millions to go on into wrestling, but in fact he went on to a career in pro wrestling that made him many, many times more money over than what he would have gotten as a Chicago Bear at that time.
Okay.
And that was where he first gets into the industry and spends about a decade before he and a promoter named Wally Carbo purchased the rights to the Minnesota Boxing and Wrestling Club, which they turned into the American Wrestling Association, the AWA, in around 1960.
Okay. And so this is one of these territories, right?
Yeah.
The AWA would be a territory.
Right. And so Minneapolis, in terms of being a hub, it's basically the headquarters for the AWA's territory. And the territory would extend certainly from Minneapolis on up to Canada, parts of Canada. You've got Chicago as part of that. You've got, as far out west as San Francisco as well.
Okay. And so people are getting this stuff weekly on TV, right? I mean, it's being fed to them. And the AWA, tell us a little bit, because this is where it really gets to be a popular sort of well-known thing, right? Is through television.
Oh, yeah. Everywhere, everything from the wrestlers themselves to the personalities on commentary, the interviewers, the managers. You just have this giant pool of personalities and characters that would later go on to great success elsewhere too. But while they were here, they were as popular as it gets as well. And anything from heroes and villains and so forth. That was something that was on full display on a weekly basis on television, but also in the arenas around the Twin Cities.
Okay.
You would have these TV shows that would serve as not just your weekly entertainment, but oftentimes they would be promoting an event that some cases would be happening. And because this was often a pre-recorded television show, they would be promoting an event that would be happening later that night.
Okay.
And you'd have fans flocking to arenas around here, in some cases drawing more of an audience than the Minnesota Twins game going on the same day.
And what general time frame are we talking about now?
The AWA was in existence from the early 60s up until late 80s, or about 1990, 1991.
Okay. So Gagne, he starts as an athlete. He becomes a businessman. He launches this promotion. They're on TV. They're doing well. But Gagne's still in the ring. I mean, he's a star of his own company in a sense, right?
Yeah, he was their top star, their top champion several times, or quite a few times during the time that he was still active in the ring. I think by the time that he retired, he was in his mid-50s even, which was quite a feat.
Okay, he's running this promotion, he's in the ring, and he's got this wrestling school, and they're churning out wrestlers, many of whom are going on to big things. So tell us about this school, because it's a very unusual school, too.
Yeah, so he very much was responsible for training a whole slew of eventual Hall of Fame level talent. And, I spoke with a local wrestling historian named George Shire, and he had tallied up upwards of 150 top main event level stars that came out of this school over the years that it was active. It was 6 hours a day, 6 day long school that would happen on an annual basis, held inside of a barn on Gagne's property in Minnesota and
in Eden Prairie.
Yeah, around that area. And
this is like I think you mentioned an unheated barn.
Right. That's another famous part of the retelling of the story. And I've seen footage of it. Does not at all dispel that. You've got people that are bundled up, that are being slammed on a probably not very soft surface given the time of year.
Right.
And so you had just a whole lot of eventual pro wrestling luminaries that emerged from this. Mm-hmm. You've got Ric Flair, who is seen as by many as the greatest pro wrestler of all time. You had Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude, people who were from the Twin Cities and went on to great success too on a national scale. Mm-hmm. Iron Sheik recently passed away. Jim Brunzell. You had Gagne's own son, Greg Gagne, and then other legends such as Ricky Steamboat as well.
Okay. All right. So Gagne's made this whole big promotion, American Wrestling Association. It's churning out people, and Ventura went through that system, right? Or at least he was part of the promotion, maybe not the school.
So yeah, the school was one thing. The promotion itself was also the forum for a lot of people to, at the early stages of their career, kind of make it and develop their own characters, their skill sets, or just get on the radar of a wider audience. So yeah, you certainly had Jesse Ventura. Mm-hmm. You also had Hulk Hogan, who would eventually go on to become synonymous with pro wrestling among people who don't even follow it at all.
Right. And so that's a good segue to the sort of creation of a more national scene for wrestling, which was very kind of controversial in a sense. So Vince McMahon is a name people may know, kind of like Gagne. I mean, he's not a wrestler in the way Gagne was, but he is similar to Gagne. He's both the businessman and he's sort of a part of the show, right?
Yeah.
And so, but Vince McMahon he changes the game here and creates what we know today in a sense. So tell us a little bit about what happened there, because this ends up being kind of the death knell of the AWA.
Yeah, so Vince McMahon, he took over for his father a promotion that would go on to become WWF, or be known as WWF, and certainly today known as WWE.
Which was because of a lawsuit from the World Wildlife Foundation? Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the same organization.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But this was very early 80s when this was happening. And up until that point, wrestling being a territorial, regional-based enterprise, you'd have promoters in the respective regions agreeing to not infringe on each other's borders. They would even share talent, and swap top stars to go and star in those areas for a couple months at a time. But Vince McMahon starts to poach some of those top stars for his own company. He would also pay the people that the way that it worked at the AWA, at least Vern Gagne was known for just basically having handshake deals with his talents, to where they would just agree to I'll pay you this, you show up here. But Vince McMahon started to get into contracts with them and would even pay them more than what they would have gotten on a given event for Gagne and other promotions. He'd pay them more to stay home and not go there until the contract was up. And
I'm sure there's still a lot of bad blood about how this went down.
Yeah, I mean it was something that he just sort of was ahead of the curve in that way, but he's credited for basically killing off the territory system there at that time.
But in some ways, also then making pro wrestling into a much bigger.
Well, yeah, he started to harness closed circuit TV, cable television, making the WWF a national product, something that would broadcast everywhere. And I was even told that he would, in those early stages, would even pay networks not to broadcast his competitors.
Okay, and so Hogan is an example of one of these people who was with AWA and then gets pulled into WWF?
Yeah, Hulk Hogan, again, obviously pretty much everybody knows who he is, but at the time, part of that is because of how successful he was in the early stages of his career, certainly in the early stages of Vince McMahon's ownership of WWF. He became an absolute pivotal star for Vince McMahon to get WWF on such a national stage.
Right.
Before that, though, he was really coming into his own in the AWA and was one of the top draws there at the time, and was certainly on his way to where he would end up. And it just happened to be that Vince McMahon took him and continued that story in a way that was very lucrative to Vince McMahon, and happened to coincide with just this moment in time where the influence or the just like the vibrancy of these territorial promotions was just starting to be on the way out.
Right. And what's, again, just to put us all in a place and time here, what is the general time frame where this transition is happening?
Well, that's starting to happen early 80s, and by 1991 the AWA is done.
Okay. And so keeping with the chronology here, there's a moment in, I think it's 95, the WWF gets some competition and it all goes down at the Mall of America. It's a Minnesota wrestling moment that we should talk about. This is WCW, is that right?
Yeah, and that promotion had been around quite a bit before then. However, the 1990s, the story of pro wrestling history, that chapter is known for what's called the Monday Night Wars. So you've got these weekly Monday night primetime wrestling shows that eventually mostly would be live on the air, would go head to head. And this all began in 1995 with WCW's Monday Nitro premiering inside the Mall of America. So now we're getting into you have the AWA and its deep influence on pro wrestling, but then Minnesota just continues to be over the years, the site for quite pivotal, but also just interesting little trivia facts like that too.
Right. Okay. So the legacy of this sort of the heyday of wrestling in Minnesota still does live on today, not only on that national scene and how it influenced that, but then there's still wrestling, pro style wrestling, although it's maybe not the same as the big TV shows, but there's still pro style wrestling happening here in Minnesota.
Yeah, well, certainly you've got the WWE coming to town quite regularly, as does one of its top competitors now called All Elite Wrestling, which is AEW, comes here quite a bit too. But on a more regular basis, you've got smaller promotions such as First Wrestling or Steel Domain Wrestling. They'll have events at breweries. They'll be at American Legions, VFWs. But in the case of First Wrestling, which was founded by Eric Cannon, he is somebody, just like the Ed Hellier of Steel Domain, who I interviewed for the story, both of them, they grew up watching AWA, and that was what sunk its hooks into them as fans. And this is how we get into the long-term influence of AWA, influencing sort of the next generation.
Right. And there's Minnesotans who are also going on to these national outlets, right? I mean, athletes. Yeah,
certainly. You've got Brock Lesnar, who went to the University of Minnesota and started as a collegiate wrestler there. He went on to one of the most lucrative careers, and he's still active. But he's one of the top draws for the WWE. You've got someone like Gable Steveson, who's trying to follow in that footsteps. He's just getting started, so the jury is very much still out on whether he'll have a bright career. But there's a lot of people who happen to be from Minnesota who are continuing on their own careers as well.
Okay. And so if people want to get some sense of what this all looks like, I would recommend going into the story and looking. There's a YouTube video we embedded on there. You've got Jesse Ventura, you got Vern Gagne, and you've got Mad Dog Vachon and another wrestler. And there you get a sense of what this all looked like. So I would just recommend checking that out. Well, Stephen, thank you so much. I think this is so fascinating, and I'm glad that you wrote the story for us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like to see us tackle here at Curious Minnesota? Send it to curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.